Hello everyone and welcome to another Endgame episode with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. This is the third lesson on the Rook versus two connected passed pawns, and in this video we're going to take a look at the positions where only the defending king is near the pawns. In these type of positions, if the king that has the rook is really far away from the pawns, well here those pawns will win. The rook will have to sacrifice for one of the pawns and the other pawn will promote. Coming back, if the king is pretty close to the pawns, there are many resources that Black can use here to be able to draw. Black needs to realize here that because his king is far away, the best he's got here is a draw. So the plans are clear for both players. The side with the pawns will try to push one, exchange it for the rook, and then promote the other pawn. While the side with the rook will try to bring the king closer, then sacrifice the rook for the more advanced pawn and capture the other one with the king. Now the play here, it's a little bit more tricky and it's not very intuitive. That's why it's very important to be studied ahead of time. So let's get started. This position is a draw only if it's black to move. The correct play here is rook to f3, attacking the backward pawn and not the more advanced pawn. And this move is counterintuitive because when the rook fights alone against the two connected passed pawns, the play was to attack the more advanced pawn. However, that will lose in this case. So rook to f3 is the correct move. And this drawing method has a very good visual analogy called the tail hook defense method by Dvoretsky in his Endgame manual. What this move does, it prevents white from going with the king to g7. He is hooked to the tail of this pawn structure, in other words the backward pawn. If he does go to g3, what's going to happen is that black can simply take the pawn on f5, and now no matter what white does, the other pawn will be lost as well. Here, white only has two options, going with the king to h6 or to h7. If the king goes to h6, after rook to f6, that pawn is pinned, and there's nothing that white can do to prevent black from just taking that pawn. After something like king to h7, black will simply take the pawn, and a draw is achieved. And coming back, if here white plays the king to h7, well, the rook will simply go behind the pawn, and then black will simply capture, and the game is drawn again. So coming back, whenever the king is in contact with the less advanced pawn, this is your best shot of fighting for a draw. So after rook to f3, there's not much that white can do here to prevent black from taking both pawns. The only other option that white has here is either moving the pawn to g7 or moving the king to e5 or to e6. So let's take a look at all of those options. First, let's take a look at g7. After pawn to g7, black will come behind the pawn again, preventing it from promoting. King to f7, king to d4. If white promotes the pawn here, black will simply capture after the white king captures back, and now that pawn is captured as well. White will not be able to defend it, and black will capture it, and a draw is achieved. Coming back, if instead of promoting, white here moves the pawn to f6, after king to e5, black is attacking the backward pawn. There's not much that white can do here. After promoting one of the pawns, the rook will simply sacrifice, king takes the rook, and the other king takes the pawn, achieving a draw. Coming back, we looked at pawn to g7. Another option would be king to e6. What black wants to do here is move the rook to g3, preventing the pawn on f5 to move to f6, as he's going to be able to take the pawn on g6 with the pin and then just sacrifice the rook for the other one. So here white needs to move the king to f7. After king to d4, g7, king to e5, f6, king to f5, the same type of play is reached, where white is going to promote the pawn, black will sacrifice the rook. After the rook gets captured, black will be able to capture the backward pawn, and another draw is achieved. Coming back, the last variation we have is king to e5, and here black needs to go back to g3. After f6, black needs to be super careful here. Taking the pawn will be a terrible mistake because after f7, the rook will not be able to come behind the pawn and also cannot reach the 8th rank as the pawn attacks that square. And here, what's going to happen is that white will actually be able to promote here. After something like rook to b6, the pawn will promote and black is in trouble. But coming back after f6, the correct play here is rook to g5. After this, if the king moves to e6, now black can capture it on g6, pinning the pawn on f6 and then being able to sacrifice the rook and reaching a draw. Coming back, if the king moves to f4 instead of e6, what's going to happen is that black will be able to take the pawn on g6. White cannot push the pawn forward as black will be able to go to f6 taking that pawn. So here the best play for white is to move the king to f5, from which black will simply sacrifice the rook and another draw is achieved. Coming back from the very beginning, I do want to show you what's wrong with rook to g3, attacking the third advanced pawn. After this, what white will do is move the king to g7, and now black is not going to be able to prevent one of the pawns from promoting. After something like king to d4, the pawn will march to f6, king e5, pawn to f7, rook to f3, the pawn will promote. After black captures and the king captures back, even though black is going to be able to attack the pawn on g6, that pawn will be able to march forward where the king defends the pawn, and now white is going to win this game. And next I'm going to go over another example that's a little bit more complicated, but the same drawing technique can be achieved. We could see here that black is in contact with the backward pawn, so white can start with the rook to h7, the tail hook defense method. And now there's two possible plays for black, either moving the far advanced pawn to g3 or moving the backward pawn to h4. So let's take a look at moving the pawn to h4 first. After this, white will come with rook to g7 check, king to f4, rook to f7 check, king to g3, king to g7, pawn to h3, king to g6, an excellent move. White wants to make sure that he's able to attack the backward pawn, while if the other pawn tries to promote, rook to h7 will be able to sacrifice the rook and then capture the backward pawn with the king. So from here, black again has two options, either moving the pawn to h2 or trying to move the king to g2. So let's take a look at both options. If the pawn moves to h2, obviously that pawn is one move away from promoting, so rook to h7 is needed. After something like king to g2, king to g5, attacking the backward pawn. Pawn to g3, king to g4. And now there's not much that black can do here. Obviously, if the pawn promotes, white will sacrifice the rook, black will take, and white will take the other pawn. And coming back, better play for black would be king to f2. But after this, white will be able to come with the rook to g3. And now, this prevents the pawn from g3 moving forward, as white will be able to capture on h2, pinning the other pawn, and then he's going to be able to take it. So coming back, the other option that black has here is king to g1. But after rook to g3 check, the king will move away, then white will simply go behind the pawn, and then sacrifice the rook for that pawn and get a draw as well. Coming back, we looked at pawn moving to h2, and rook going behind. The other try that black has here is king to g2. So after king to g2, white will come and attack the backward pawn. Pawn to h2, we know the rook will go behind, and we've seen this play where white will be able to get a draw. And after g3, the king will move to g4, pawn to h2, rook to h7, and we've seen this play already where if the pawn promotes, white will sacrifice the rook and then take the other pawn. And if the king goes to f2, we saw rook to h3, be able to achieve a draw. Now coming back to the very beginning, we analyzed this position where black moved the pawn to h4, and now we're going to take a look at the other play where black is going to move the pawn to g3 first. Well, in this case, white now has to march the king. In this variation, white has to be extra careful. When looking at this position, we need to realize that now the pawn on h5 is the backward pawn, and that's the pawn that the white king needs to be able to attack, while the rook will have to sacrifice for the pawn on the g file, as that's the more advanced pawn. So here the correct play will be king to e7. There are other variations, but I'm just going to go over one of them. So here there's two tries that black has, moving the pawn to h4 or moving the king to f4. So let's take a look at this option first. If the king moves to f4, white has to be extra careful here. He cannot take the pawn on h5, as after g2, the rook cannot come behind the pawn and cannot reach the 8th rank, as he's going to be captured. So coming back, the correct play would be rook to f7 check. After king to g4, rook to g7 check. And now the black king can either go to f3 or to h3. If he goes with the king to h3, white is going to go with the king to f6, going after the backward pawn on h5. Pawn to g2, rook to g5. White needs to be careful. He cannot attack the backward pawn right away, as now the rook is not attacking the pawn on the g file, and that pawn will promote with check. So rook to g5 is needed here. After pawn to h4, king to g6, king to h2, king to h5, attacking the backward pawn. And after h3, king to h4, this game is drawn. Again, the rook will sacrifice for the advanced pawn, and then the black king will be able to capture the backward pawn. And coming back, we looked at king to h3. If king to f3 is played here, white can move the king to f6, going after the backward pawn on h5. And here, if black is trying to promote the pawn right away, well, this will not work because the rook will simply be able to sacrifice right now. After black takes the rook and the white king attacks the pawn on h5, black is not able to defend it and that pawn will be gone. So white achieved the draw. And coming back, if instead of moving pawn to g2, if black here moves the pawn to h4, well, now white is able to attack the backward pawn on h5 as the pawn on the g file is not able to promote on the next move with check, which gives white enough time to attack the backward pawn. From here, if black moves the pawn to h3, after king to h4, white is able to achieve a draw. The best play for black will be here to move the pawn to h2, and after the rook takes the pawn on g3 with check, king to f2, rook to h3, and now this game is drawn. Coming back, I do want to mention that if black doesn't play the pawn to h2 here and makes the mistake to move the pawn to g2, well, here actually white will win the game. The white king can take the pawn on h3 as the pawn on the g file cannot promote since the rook will simply take it, and after king to f2, white will be able to capture that pawn and win the game in this case. And coming back at this location, we looked at king to f4. The last variation we didn't analyze is pawn to h4. After pawn to h4, white can simply move the king to e6, trying to get the king closer to the backward pawn. Let's say king to g4. Now, a very important move, rook to g7 check, is needed here. The reason for that is that the white king cannot make any progress towards the backward pawn. Coming back, if white makes the mistake of moving king to e5, you could see that he's still 2 squares away from attacking the backward pawn, the same as he was on g4, 2 squares away from attacking the pawn. So if he moves the king to e5, he's actually going to lose this game. The correct play for black here would be moving the pawn to h3, and now that backward pawn is not going to be the backward pawn anymore. After something like king to e4, black is going to move the pawn to h2, and now the rook is stuck to the h file as that pawn will promote on the next move. He could try a rook to g7, but this is not going to help because of the move king to h5. White cannot capture the pawn on g3 as the pawn on the h file will promote. And coming back, if white is going to check the king again, the king will be able to go to g6, attacking the rook, and after something like rook to h3 and pawn to g2, the rook cannot prevent one of the pawns from promoting. After capturing on h2, the pawn on g file will promote. Coming back, we looked at the mistake that white made with king to e5, and after h3, we looked at king to e4. I do want to mention that moving the rook to g7 check here would also be a mistake, because after king to f3, rook to h7, pawn to h2, king to f5, king to e3 here, an excellent move. There's nothing that white can do now. After king to g4 attacking the backward pawn, that backward pawn will march forward, and now white will not be able to stop those pawns. After something like rook takes h2, the other pawn will promote and black will win this game. So coming back, after h4, king to e6, king to g4, rook to g7 check is needed here. And now black has two options. He can move the king to f4 or the king to f3. If he moves the king to f4, after rook to h7, pawn to g2, rook takes h4 check, king to f3, rook to h3 check, king to f4, rook to h4 check. Black cannot get out of the checks, and if he is going to try to hide behind the checks, let's say king to g3, then after rook to h8, if that pawn promotes, after rook to g8, white will be able to capture the queen and draw the game. And coming back, the other option that black has is king to f3. After king to f3, another check is needed here, so rook to f7 is required. If he moves the king to f5, trying to attack the backward pawn, well, he is too far away. From here, black can continue with pawn to g2, and now the white rook is stuck on the g file defending that pawn since it's one move away from queening, and there's nothing that white can do. After rook to g8, the other pawn will march to h3, rook to g7, h2, then the rook will have to sacrifice and black will win the game. But coming back, after king to f3 and rook to f7 check, white will be able to save the game. Now black has only two options, moving the king to e3 or going with the king to g2 to fight together with the pawns. If he moves the king to g2, now the further advanced pawn cannot move, which gives white an extra tempo, so white can bring the king to f5. After pawn to h3, king to g4, white is attacking the backward pawns. After h2, rook to h7, we've achieved the drawing position. If the pawn promotes, the rook will sacrifice. After black takes, white will take the backward pawn. And if the king moves to f2, then white will simply move the king to f4. And black cannot make any progress. He cannot push the pawn to g2, as white will capture the pawn on h2, pinning the g pawn to the king, and then he's going to be able to capture that as well. Coming back, if black moves the king to e3, now white will go attack the further advanced pawn, rook to g7. If king to f2 is played here, white will attack the king again with rook to f7. King to e3, the rook will go back, so black is going to have to do something different. So after rook to f2 and rook to f7 check, so if he goes with the king to g1, after rook to h7, this game is drawn again. After g2, since that pawn will not promote on the next move, white has time to take the pawn on h4, and after king to f1, the rook will simply go behind the pawn and will be able to achieve a draw. And coming back, no better is pawn to h3, because the rook will be able to take the pawn on h3, and after g2, rook to g3, this game is drawn again. As you saw in this video, there's a lot of variations to take in consideration in this type of play, and you might be overwhelmed with this type of position. So what I would recommend is watch this video a couple of times to try to understand the tail hook defense idea, and also what type of moves will prevent that defense from taking place. And after that, I encourage you to visit my website masteryourchess.com and practice this position against the computer so you can become confident before moving on. After this video, I'm going to make another video of this same position, just highlighting the important moves that you want to follow. So after you've understood the position, when you're going to want to review this, you'll be able to watch just the correct play video to retrieve that information. All right, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for more lessons. If you liked my video, please subscribe, and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.